Charles Leclerc's pole position lap in Budapest didn't just surprise McLaren, it triggered something deeper inside Ferrari. As the final Q3 times lit up the timing screens, it wasn't Oscar Piastri or Lando Norris at the top, but Leclerc, pulling a lap out of nowhere on a track he once described as cursed. For the cameras, it was a feel-good turnaround, but inside the other side of the Ferrari garage, there was no celebration. Lewis Hamilton had already packed up, eliminated in Q2, finishing 12th at a circuit where he's won 8 times. And what's haunting about that result isn't just the elimination, it's the quiet, weary radio tone that followed every time, every time. No technical complaint, no data request, just resignation. It was the bookend to a weekend that started with emotional discomfort in FP1 and ended with competitive irrelevance in qualifying, a soft-spoken signal that something far more fundamental is going wrong. That radio silence echoed an earlier moment from FP1, when Hamilton, after a single exploratory lap, told engineer Riccardo Adami that the car didn't give him good feelings. The words were plain, but the implications weren't. Hamilton doesn't speak in absolutes unless something's deeply off. He didn't ask for adjustments. He didn't mention balance or grip. He just didn't trust it. And Adami's response, just one word, okay, was equally revealing. No follow-up, no recalibration, just dead air. That silence, for a driver like Hamilton, is deafening. It doesn't just reflect a technical disconnect, it signals emotional misalignment. And by the time Q2 came around, that unspoken tension had calcified into a full-blown performance wall. While Leclerc found precision in the chaos, Hamilton couldn't find flow. And in a sport where confidence is currency, he'd gone bankrupt. Leclerc's last lap heroics showed what happens when the car speaks the same language as the driver. The SF25 might not be perfect, but in the hands of a driver whose rhythm it understands, it becomes more than the sum of its specs. For Hamilton, the same machine felt alien, responsive to someone else's inputs, tuned to someone else's style. And that difference doesn't show up in the sector times. It shows up in the pauses, in the clipped radio, in the hesitations through high-speed direction changes that don't show up on camera but scream in the data. Hamilton wasn't fighting the track. He was fighting the car itself. And with every lap that failed to deliver feedback he could believe in, that fight became more internal, more personal. So when qualifying ended and Leclerc stood at the top of the grid, it wasn't just a statement about raw pace. It was a referendum on trust between driver and machine, driver and engineer, and maybe even driver and team. And as the lights go out on Sunday, that silent fracture might matter more than the grid position. Because for Hamilton, the real battle isn't with the field. It's with a car that no longer feels like his. As the paddock came to life on Saturday morning, McLaren looked untouchable. Practice times had established their authority, and the opening qualifying sessions only reinforced it. Piastri and Norris trading purple sectors with a kind of rhythmic certainty. Even the early threat of rain didn't rattle them. Their car looked dialed in for this circuit. Fast changes of direction, tight mechanical grip, and enough downforce to float through Sector 2 like it was pre-mapped. But while McLaren surged, the Ferrari garage split in two. Leclerc, calm and focused, went quietly to work. Hamilton, on the other hand, unravelled. His radio message, every time, wasn't just a complaint, it was a verdict. And when he followed it with a bitter remark about whether the team needed a different driver, the air in the garage shifted. This wasn't the sound of someone lacking speed, it was the voice of a driver who no longer felt part of the machine. Leclerc's Q3 lap was nearly perfect. Not aggressive, not desperate, just patient. As track temperature dipped and grip peaked, he stitched together a clean lap that caught both McLarens off guard. Piastri had been on provisional pole, Norris was just behind, but neither could respond when Leclerc delivered a 1:15.372 in the final minutes, displacing them both by mere hundredths. The car had come alive for him at exactly the right moment. And that's the difference. While Hamilton wrestled with a chassis that refused to listen, Leclerc coaxed performance out of it like a fluent speaker using his native tongue. The SF25 didn't just behave for Leclerc, it responded. Turn in, throttle pickup, mid-corner balance, it all came together. Hamilton, meanwhile, was left stranded in Q2, 12th on the grid, at a circuit where he has won more than anyone in history. No weather excuse, no mechanical failure, just misalignment between what he needed and what the car offered. And when the session ended, he wasn't angry. He was distant, detached. That emotional withdrawal, coupled with a second consecutive weekend of setup misfire, points to a deeper fracture. Ferrari's rear suspension update may have improved baseline performance, but it seems calibrated around Leclerc's driving DNA, aggressive on entry, responsive at high speed. For Hamilton, who builds confidence through feel and balance, the car now behaves like a foreign object. So qualifying wasn't just a story about lap times, it was a referendum on Ferrari's internal trajectory. Two drivers, same machinery, but fundamentally different relationships with the car beneath them. And if one of those relationships continues to decay, it won't matter how fast the SF25 is on paper, because Hamilton doesn't race on data alone. He races on trust, and right now, that trust is quietly vanishing. Behind the lap times and press conferences, a more complicated story was unfolding in the simulator data. Ferrari's latest rear suspension update, first tested at Spa, then refined for Budapest, was designed to enhance high-speed stability and corner entry consistency, particularly under heavy braking. On paper, it delivered. Leclerc immediately found harmony with the new spec, praising the car's responsiveness and praising the setup team for aligning the chassis with his feedback. But Hamilton, he remained unsettled. The simulator logs told the tale. In 5 separate runs calibrated to his driving profile, softer rear compliance, gentler torque curves, and a longer braking trace, the data showed improved corner entry confidence, but a measurable drop in high-speed consistency. The numbers were clear, feel improved, but lap time didn't. For a driver who builds trust through incremental balance and layered feedback, that trade-off was unacceptable. And more troubling, the same simulator run, using Leclerc's inputs, showed not just balance, but performance. The car behaved predictably when driven like Leclerc, which led to an uncomfortable conclusion circulating quietly within Ferrari's engineering division. Maybe the SF25 simply isn't a Hamilton car. This isn't about preference, it's about architecture. Leclerc initiates direction change early, brakes late, and thrives on initial rotation. Hamilton delays rotation, prefers progressive balance, and needs rear stability to come alive mid-corner, not instantly on turn-in. The upgraded suspension, with its firmer geometry and tighter rebound control, favours the former. The result? A car that listens clearly to one driver and whispers back hesitantly to the other. And when Hamilton switches to brake map 7 mid-stint, an experimental map designed to shift braking energy toward the front axle and stabilise unpredictable rear movement, it's not a mechanical adjustment, it's a message. It's what he used in Baku years ago, when Mercedes refused to soften the rear. It's what he turns to when he's no longer confident the car will listen. Yet this weekend, Ferrari didn't include that map usage in the official debrief. Only those watching the onboard overlays, those who knew what to look for, noticed the change. And inside the garage, that quiet omission sparked a whisper. Were Ferrari trying to control the narrative? The silence surrounding Hamilton's discomfort isn't accidental. A performance analyst, tasked with interpreting driver behaviour through telemetry, was reportedly reassigned from trackside to simulator duty after raising concerns Friday night. Not about grip, not about setup, but about trust. The analyst pointed out milliseconds of hesitation during high-speed direction changes. Not mechanical delay, psychological delay. A driver not overdriving, but underbelieving. And in a team built on precision and politics, that kind of language is dangerous. It reframes the problem not as something to be fixed with wrenches and spreadsheets, but something deeper, something relational. Hamilton didn't ask for a wing change, he didn't request more rotation, he just didn't feel the car, and that's harder to solve, because you can't tune trust with a torque wrench. What's emerging at Ferrari isn't just a difference in driving styles, it's a strategic identity crisis. Inside the setup group, 2 camps have quietly formed. One optimizes for Leclerc, precise, aggressive, data-reliant. The other is trying, often unsuccessfully, to interpret Hamilton's more intuitive, feel-based feedback. It's not a feud, not yet, but it's an unresolved tension that's bleeding into every corner of the SF25's development. In recent weeks, some engineers have reportedly begun designing setup baselines exclusively around Leclerc's telemetry, using his brake traces and steering inputs as the default. Not because they've chosen sides, but because the numbers are easier to work with. The lap time is there. The logic is clean. Leclerc's style produces results the data can replicate and refine. Hamilton, on the other hand, provides subtleties, phrases like "the rear feels anxious" or "the entry loads aren't consistent," which don't slot neatly into spreadsheets. They require interpretation. And in a team still adjusting to his communication style, that interpretation has started to feel like guesswork. The consequence is slow erosion. When engineers no longer feel confident interpreting a driver's language, they stop pushing as hard to unlock it. And that's how a gap opens, not just in lap time, but in influence. When Leclerc gets in the car, The garage watches for performance. When Hamilton speaks, they listen for problems. That psychological framing has massive implications. Leclerc becomes the development anchor. Hamilton becomes the variable. And as the car evolves around one philosophy, the other is left adapting to a machine that moves further and further from its comfort zone. It's not deliberate sabotage, it's inertia. Left unchecked, it becomes identity. And Ferrari's strategic decisions this weekend revealed that inertia in motion. During Friday's long-run simulations, Hamilton reportedly requested a softer differential map to help with traction on exit in Sector 3. The change was tested briefly, produced marginal comfort, but was ultimately shelved before qualifying. In contrast, Leclerc's request for a revised anti-roll bar setting was implemented immediately and remained locked in through Q3. One driver's feedback led to systemic change. The other's was treated as temporary. That split in response sends a message, whether intentional or not. It suggests a hierarchy, not just in performance, but in belief. Now zoom out. Look at what this means in championship terms. Ferrari are locked in a three-way fight. McLaren on pure form, Red Bull on recovery mode, Mercedes with scattered brilliance, and yet their greatest variable isn't external, it's internal. They have two world-class drivers, but only one whose rhythm currently shapes the car. And while Leclerc is thriving, Hamilton is being asked to adapt to a chassis that resists his instincts. If that dynamic continues, it risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Leclerc gets stronger, Hamilton gets quieter, and Ferrari's so-called dual leader strategy devolves into a single driver project. That's not just a tactical mistake, it's a strategic narrowing of identity, one that could define not just their race in Budapest, but their direction into 2026 and beyond. For all the strategy meetings and simulator sessions, Formula One still runs on human chemistry. And inside the cockpit, the most critical relationship isn't with the chassis, it's with the voice in your ear. For Leclerc, that voice is Xavi Marcos, someone who knows when to talk and when to listen, someone who understands his driver's rhythm and leans into it. For Hamilton, that voice is Riccardo Adami, a veteran engineer, technically brilliant, but emotionally misaligned. The signs have been building quietly since Spa. The exchanges have grown shorter, the feedback loops tighter, the tone flatter. It's not open conflict, it's emotional drift. And for Hamilton, a driver who spent years being synchronized with Peter Bonington, his longtime Mercedes engineer who knew his moods better than he did, that drift matters. When Hamilton speaks in feelings, he expects a response not just in numbers but in empathy. And lately that empathy has gone missing. It showed again in Hungary. When Hamilton radioed in Q2 with visible frustration, Adami offered little more than acknowledgement. No probing question, no structured feedback, just a muted copy and silence. That silence wasn't tactical, it was symptomatic. Adami isn't translating Hamilton's language, he's filtering it. And in a high-pressure environment like Ferrari, where communication is already politicized, that filter becomes a bottleneck. The messages get colder, the trust thins. And for a driver like Hamilton, who operates not on pure aggression but on feel and flow, that thinning turns into performance decay. Because once a driver stops feeling heard, he stops reaching for the edge. The risk-reward calculus changes, the inputs get safer, the lap times drop. That erosion isn't always visible in the data. It lives in the tenths left on the table, the hesitation into turn-in, the throttle lift a few meters too early. And when those moments accumulate, they don't just affect the stopwatch, they affect identity. Hamilton didn't come to Ferrari to be second voice in a one-driver team. He came to reshape the culture, to inject his experience into a team that's flirted with greatness but failed to commit. But reshaping a team requires trust, not just from the engineers, but from the garage, the management, and most critically, the guy reading your tyre temps while you're in the braking zone. The emotional signals from Hamilton this weekend suggest that trust is cracking, not loudly but persistently. And the deeper irony is that this is a story he's lived before. Back in 2016, when Mercedes shifted the steering rack geometry without his full buy-in, a silent rift opened. Back then, Hamilton absorbed it, recalibrated and fought his way through. But now, in the twilight of his career, the patience for reinvention is thinner. He doesn't want to adapt again. He wants to lead. And Ferrari, despite all the rhetoric about dual leader strategies and equal footing, is beginning to look like a team quietly choosing its favourite. For Hamilton, that realisation is more painful than a bad qualifying. It's the sting of history repeating itself, and this time, he sees it coming. The Hungarian Grand Prix was never going to decide the championship, but it may have just revealed who's really still in it. Before qualifying, McLaren looked like the title favourites on rhythm and consistency alone. Piastri held the points lead, Norris was closing fast, and their upgrades were delivering week after week. Red Bull had pace in flashes but lacked composure, while Mercedes remained unpredictable. Ferrari, then, was the wild card, capable of brilliance but often sabotaged by its own internal contradictions. Leclerc's pole was a triumph of execution, no question, but Hamilton's Q2 exit, and more importantly the way it happened, was a warning flare that Ferrari's so-called two-pronged title campaign may already be folding in on itself, and the numbers support that tension. Heading into Budapest, Hamilton sat fourth in the standings, still mathematically in the hunt. But a P12 start, barring chaos, almost guarantees he'll drop further. Meanwhile, Leclerc, who had been hovering just behind the McLarens, is now in prime position to claw back crucial points on Sunday. The shift isn't dramatic, but it's directional. And in a sport where momentum often outweighs math, direction is everything. The irony, of course, is that Ferrari built their 2025 strategy around balance. 2 top-tier drivers, 2 data streams, 2 development philosophies. It was supposed to be their answer to Red Bull's Verstappen-centric model and McLaren's emerging pecking order. But what Budapest showed, more clearly than any simulator log or press release, was that balance without alignment is just conflict in slow motion. Leclerc is now not only faster but more integrated. His feedback shapes the car, his setups are prioritised, his rhythms define the race weekend. Hamilton, by contrast, has become Ferrari's variable. And in the unforgiving arena of championship calculus, variables get minimised. If Ferrari continues down this path, consciously or not, they'll have to make a decision. Do they double down on Leclerc, treating him as the de facto number one in all but name? Or do they recalibrate, risking short-term performance to ensure Hamilton can still deliver when it counts? The standings offer little room for error. McLaren's consistency means they're likely to score with both drivers every weekend. If Ferrari lets one side of the garage fall behind, even by tenths, even by a single setup call, it compounds over time. A 5-point gap here, a 7-point swing there, and suddenly Leclerc is fighting 2 papaya cars while Hamilton watches from outside the podium group. And that's the real danger. Not just the points Hamilton will lose in Hungary, but the subtle, almost invisible advantage McLaren gains every time Ferrari splits its energy. Because while Piastri and Norris operate in harmony, trading setups, sharing data, pushing each other, Hamilton and Leclerc are drifting into parallel but separate projects. One car chasing titles, the other chasing connection. And in a season this tight, that kind of divergence isn't sustainable. It's a championship liability hiding behind the illusion of optionality. And if Ferrari doesn't resolve it soon, their biggest fight won't be against McLaren or Red Bull, it'll be against themselves. Formula One has seen this movie before. 2 elite drivers, 1 car development path, and a team torn between philosophies it swore it could balance. The warning signs always look familiar in hindsight. Mismatched radio dynamics, divergent setup trends, selective feedback adoption. In 2016, Mercedes promised equilibrium between Hamilton and Rosberg. Until the steering rack change, Hamilton didn't want quietly reshape the car's behaviour and triggered a silent Cold War. In 2018, Ferrari told the world it was building around Vettel, until Leclerc's rising precision and quiet resilience rendered that commitment obsolete. And in 2021, Red Bull claimed it was supporting both Verstappen and Perez until the data said otherwise, and the garage tilted around one man's title destiny. What connects all these moments is not just performance gaps, it's trust gaps. And trust, once frayed inside a team, becomes a structural fault, not loud, but irreversible. Ferrari now stands on the edge of that same cliff. On paper, this is the most balanced driver lineup they've fielded in years. In theory, Hamilton and Leclerc should complement each other, one bringing intuition, experience and emotional depth, the other offering precision, consistency and raw qualifying firepower. But what's happening instead is a quiet replication of patterns that have derailed campaigns before. The team, perhaps without even realising it, is leaning into the driver who is easiest to engineer for. And that has a gravity of its own. When one voice starts defining setup baselines, dictating simulator parameters, and subtly setting the tone in post-session debriefs, the other voice doesn't just lose volume, it loses authority. And for a champion like Hamilton, that erosion hits differently. In the garage, engineers talk in quiet tones about timing traces and rotational windows. But what they're really analysing is confidence. And history shows that once a team subconsciously begins filtering one driver's feedback through the lens of skepticism, the downstream effect is catastrophic. Decisions take longer. Risk tolerance drops. Car upgrades skew toward one driving model. And by the time it becomes publicly obvious, it's already irreversible. Vettel felt that shift in 2020 when Ferrari stopped adjusting the chassis around his complaints and began prototyping exclusively with Leclerc's inputs. Ricciardo felt it at Red Bull. Bottas lived it at Mercedes. Now, Hamilton is beginning to sense it in a team he hoped would treat him as a co-architect, not just a high-profile passenger. And perhaps most telling of all, Hamilton isn't protesting. He's withdrawing. That too is historically consistent. In 2011, when McLaren failed to act on his early feedback about aero instability, he responded by going quiet. At Mercedes, when he sensed the narrative shifting around Rosberg, he stopped explaining himself on the radio and let the data tell the story. In both cases, the silence was surgical. And now, in Ferrari Red, it's happening again. The lap times may not scream dysfunction, but the rhythms do. The hesitation into corners, the clipped responses, the invisible delay between instinct and action. It's not dramatic, but it's decisive. And in the story of Formula One, that's always the moment before something breaks. When Ferrari introduced its new rear suspension package at Spa, the intention was clear: greater consistency through medium and high-speed corners, improved traction stability on exit, and a more predictable platform under load transitions. The numbers backed it up, particularly on Charles Leclerc's side of the garage. His confidence grew immediately, especially during lateral load phases, where the previous version of the SF25 had been twitchy under throttle. The updated system featured revised damper geometry and stiffer rebound curves, which stabilized the car on corner entry and gave the rear a firmer, more communicative edge. For Leclerc, who attacks the corner with early commitment and thrives on a car that rotates sharply but predictably, the change was a revelation. His inputs now matched the car's response window almost perfectly. But for Hamilton, the same evolution felt like a betrayal. Not of development direction, but of feel. Hamilton's driving style relies on rear-end compliance, subtle weight transfer, and progressive load acceptance. He doesn't force the car into rotation, he coaxes it. The new suspension profile took that option away. It favoured immediacy, something that rewarded Leclerc's decisive inputs, but left Hamilton with hesitation mid-phase. That hesitation showed up in the telemetry, not as a drop in throttle or brake, but in timing. His steering corrections through turns 4 and 11 in Hungary were minuscule in amplitude, but wide in latency. The car responded before he committed, meaning the trust loop between input and feedback was broken. It's not a setup issue, it's an architectural mismatch. And that's the part that can't be fixed with a damper tweak or a ride height adjustment. It's baked into the suspension's behaviour. Behind the scenes, there have been quiet tests. In Friday's simulator runs, Hamilton's team trialled a slightly softened rear compliance setting with reduced rebound stiffness and a recalibrated torque ramp on corner exit. The results were mixed. In low-speed corners, the car's predictability returned. But in high-speed sectors, the SF25 became skittish, unable to maintain Leclerc's baseline stability. The engineers had a choice: optimize for one driver or compromise for both. And the decision was subtle but clear. They prioritized stability over feel. Leclerc's setup remained untouched into Saturday. Hamilton's was adjusted, but only slightly, and not in the direction he preferred. For a driver who's spent his career building trust through iteration, the message was impossible to miss. The car is not being built for you anymore. Ferrari insists the SF25 is neutral, adaptable, a tool both drivers can shape. But the architecture tells a different story. The rear suspension, as it stands, reflects one philosophy: Leclerc's. And that matters, not because it suggests favoritism, but because it defines trajectory. Cars don't just carry drivers, they evolve with them. And if that evolution begins to favour one set of hands, the other is left chasing performance in a language they don't speak fluently. That's where Hamilton is now, not just driving a Ferrari, but interpreting one. And in the tight corners of the Hungaroring, where feel is everything, that gap isn't measured in seconds. It's measured in confidence. And confidence, once gone, doesn't return through setup. It returns through belief. Ferrari, as of now, is building a car that believes in someone else. While Ferrari wrestles with its internal split, the rest of the grid is watching, carefully, and in some cases, opportunistically. In the paddock, performance isn't just measured by lap times. It's measured by signals, body language in the garage, radio tone, strategic debrief order. And this weekend, those signals from Ferrari were loud in the quietest ways. Hamilton's subdued demeanour, the clipped feedback loops, the visible de-emphasis of his setup direction, those weren't missed by rival teams. McLaren in particular has taken notice. With Piastri leading the championship and Norris hovering just behind, their strength lies not just in speed, but in internal clarity. Both drivers push each other, share data transparently, and approach race weekends with synchronized expectations. That harmony isn't just a cultural win, it's a strategic weapon. While Ferrari spends resources resolving internal tension, McLaren spends theirs refining execution. And as Hungary's qualifying showed, that execution remains razor sharp. Leclerc's pole only arrived because McLaren misjudged their final runs, not because they lost the car. At Red Bull, the response is more guarded, but no less strategic. Verstappen's 8th place start in Budapest was a reflection of broader struggles. Tyre warm-up inconsistency, lack of downforce predictability in mixed grip conditions, and an aero package that hasn't responded cleanly to their mid-season updates. But Red Bull's true strength lies in their ability to read the long game. Internally, their engineers are already shifting focus to circuits like Zandvoort and Suzuka, where balance and straight-line efficiency will matter more than raw grip. And crucially, they're watching Ferrari with interest. Because instability in a rival team doesn't always need to be attacked, it can be waited out. If Hamilton continues to drift further from competitive relevance, and if Leclerc's momentum builds without a second car to absorb strategic pressure, Red Bull knows they'll only need to contain McLaren to regain ground. Ferrari, in essence, is removing itself from the dual-driver chessboard. That changes the game entirely. Mercedes, for their part, are operating in the shadows. Russell's Q3 run to 4th on the grid shows there's still pace in the W16, but consistency remains elusive. What's more interesting is what they're not saying. Internally, the team is still debating its 2026 driver lineup, and Hungary added a new layer of urgency. If Hamilton's Ferrari move continues to sour, Mercedes may suddenly find themselves holding leverage they didn't expect to have again so soon. There are whispers in the paddock of an early exit clause in Hamilton's deal. Nothing confirmed, nothing public, but enough to make people pause. For Toto Wolff, who has always operated on a horizon longer than one season, the Ferrari fracture isn't just a headline, it's a scenario to model. And if Hamilton becomes a free agent sooner than expected, the politics of 2026 just changed overnight. Across the top teams, the thinking is clear. Ferrari's car might be fast, but its structure is fragile. And in a season this compressed, where margins are shrinking and the calendar offers fewer easy circuits, fragility is an opportunity. McLaren will aim to press it by isolating Leclerc in strategy. Red Bull will aim to outlast it by optimizing consistency. And Mercedes? They may be planning to capitalize on it by preparing for the next chapter altogether. Either way, Ferrari's struggle isn't happening in a vacuum. It's being measured, lap by lap, driver by driver, by rivals ready to strike the moment the gap opens just wide enough. The Hungarian Grand Prix may not have rewritten the championship standings, but it may have redrawn Ferrari's strategic future. Internally, the team must now confront a growing asymmetry, not just in performance, but in identity. With Charles Leclerc taking pole and building momentum, he naturally becomes the gravitational centre of the SF25's ongoing evolution. Each weekend that Ferrari responds more clearly to his feedback and less to Hamilton's nudges that process further. On paper, Ferrari can continue speaking about equal status and dual-led development. But inside the garage, the mechanics know better. Engineers flock towards certainty. Right now, Leclerc provides it. Hamilton doesn't. And that difference becomes a tide, not malicious, just inevitable. And unless something shifts radically and soon, Hamilton will find himself orbiting a team he was supposed to lead. The challenge isn't just technical, it's psychological. Hamilton has rebuilt before, but he's never had to do it while chasing a teammate in a car tuned away from his instincts. At Mercedes, every dip in form came with a shared language of belief. The car might not have been perfect, but the system trusted him to find its peak. At Ferrari, that loop isn't complete. The engineers nod, they listen, but they don't move. And when feedback doesn't translate into change, a driver stops giving it with full belief. That's the danger now. The final part of Hamilton's feedback loop, trust that the team will act, has frayed. Rebuilding that requires more than just a good race. It requires institutional commitment, a willingness to develop in his direction, even when the data says Leclerc's path is faster. Because performance isn't always linear, and what Hamilton needs isn't the car's best numbers. It's a car that lets him chase them his way. That decision, whether to double down on one driver or reinvest in balance, won't just affect Ferrari's race strategy. It will shape the architecture of the next 6 months. The next set of upgrades is already in motion. Simulator settings, aerodynamic trade-offs, even brake migration profiles, all of them evolve from the foundation that engineers believe in most. And if Leclerc's input continues to define that foundation, Hamilton will be left interpreting a car designed to speak another dialect. The irony is that Ferrari may win short-term battles by doing so. Leclerc is fast, confident, and capable of delivering podiums now. But they risk losing the war of identity. Because the Hamilton project wasn't just about speed, it was about transformation. And if the team walks away from that vision before it's even begun, they may never know what kind of potential they left on the table. Monza looms just 3 weeks away. Ferrari's home race. A weekend drenched in legacy, pressure, and national expectation. If Hungary was a quiet fracture, Monza will be a megaphone. The Tifosi don't just watch lap times, they feel chemistry. And if the disconnect between Hamilton and Ferrari becomes visible there, it will move from the paddock to the headlines, from quiet tension to public reckoning. And once that happens, it's no longer a setup issue, it's a crisis of belief. And crises in Formula One never resolve quietly. As Formula One prepares for its next major regulatory shift in 2026, every race now casts a longer shadow than the points table alone suggests. The car launched next year won't just be a product of wind tunnel time and CFD simulations. It will be a manifestation of who the team listens to, whose vision defines the direction, and which philosophy wins the internal war. Ferrari's decision to bring in Lewis Hamilton was never about short-term performance alone. It was a statement of intent, a bet on leadership, legacy, and transformation. But in the wake of Hungary, that vision looks increasingly unstable. Hamilton wasn't brought to Maranello to play co-pilot. He was brought to realign a team that's hovered just outside championship contention for over a decade. But instead of stepping into a structure built around his experience, he's found himself inside one that may have already chosen its future. And that future looks a lot like Charles Leclerc. The irony is that Hamilton's strengths are perfectly aligned with what Ferrari needs long-term. A driver who understands how to lead a development cycle across regulation changes, who's lived through 3 major aerodynamic eras and won in each of them, and who knows how to build cohesion between engineering departments, trackside execution, and driver psychology. But leadership without agency is just symbolism. And if the Ferrari machine continues to evolve around Leclerc's sharper, more linear style, it risks engineering itself into a corner, one that excludes the very adaptability Hamilton was brought in to harness. For a team preparing for a complete design overhaul in 2026, locking into a single driver profile this early could be more than a tactical misstep. It could be a strategic blind spot that haunts them for years. From Hamilton's side, the long-term stakes are just as high. This move to Ferrari was never just about winning more races, it was about legacy, about finishing his career not by coasting on past glories, but by reshaping the DNA of a historic team and leaving behind a second act that matched the audacity of the first. But if Ferrari fails to meet him halfway, if they reduce his presence to a branding play rather than a cultural shift, then this chapter risks becoming a cautionary tale. Another story of a champion entering a volatile structure and finding not inspiration, but inertia. The warning signs are all there. Internal divergence, asymmetric development, emotional dissonance between driver and engineer. We've seen how these stories end. They don't always implode in public. Sometimes they just fizzle, quietly, painfully, through Sunday afternoons where one car shines and the other fades into strategic ambiguity. And as the 2026 regulations approach, that fade becomes fatal. Because in a sport defined by momentum, the groundwork for dominance is laid long before the new rules arrive. If Ferrari fails to unify its direction now, it won't matter how promising their wind tunnel numbers look next February. The fracture will already be built into the chassis, and no CFD model can simulate trust. So here we are. Budapest was meant to be a rebound for Ferrari, for Hamilton, for the evolving narrative of a team finally balancing legacy and reinvention. Instead, it exposed the tension beneath the surface. A pole position for Charles Leclerc, a Q2 exit for Lewis Hamilton, 2 drivers in the same car, yet now operating in what feel like 2 different universes. One ascending with confidence, the other circling a machine that still won't speak his language. And while the cameras will focus on Sunday's grid and the race ahead, the real story is playing out in the silences. On the radio, in the engineering meetings, behind the carefully worded statements about equal footing and shared goals. Because deep down, everyone at Ferrari knows what's really at stake here. This isn't just about points, it's about direction, about choosing who and what this team is going to be. Hamilton's words after qualifying weren't explosive. They were restrained, almost eerily calm, but they carried the weight of history. Every time, every time. It's not just about one lap. It's about a pattern, about a driver who came to Maranello to lead and now finds himself trailing in every sense that matters. Trust doesn't collapse overnight in Formula One. It unravels gradually, through ignored feedback, through set-up compromises, through weekends like this, where one side of the garage celebrates and the other side quietly packs up before Parc Fermé even finishes. And as the team looks toward Monza, the stakes couldn't be higher. Because that weekend won't just be a homecoming, it will be a test. Of Ferrari's ability to manage pressure, yes, but more importantly, of its willingness to evolve without fragmenting. To build not just around Leclerc's speed, but around a true dual-driver identity that can carry them into the 2026 era with cohesion instead of conflict. For Hamilton, the road from here is uncertain, but not hopeless. He's faced this before, at McLaren, at Mercedes. Each time he responded not with panic, but precision. He doesn't need the car to be perfect. He just needs it to be his. And if Ferrari is willing to recalibrate, to listen not just to the numbers but to the nuances, then Budapest may yet be remembered as a turning point. Not the moment Hamilton lost trust, but the moment Ferrari realised they had to earn it. Again. Until then, the questions remain. Can this high-profile pairing rediscover the chemistry it never quite found? Will Ferrari choose alignment over acceleration? And in the fight for the 2025 championship, is the car's biggest weakness still in its mechanics? Or in its mirror? One weekend won't decide it, but it will echo. And if you listen closely to the gaps between the sectors, the clipped radio replies, and the silence that follows, you'll hear the future of Ferrari taking shape, not in pole positions, but in decisions. And some of the most important ones won't be made on the track. They'll be made in the moments after.